welcome back to the Pickleball Physio podcast, where we talk about injury prevention and recovery for pickleball athletes so they can get back on the court sooner and stay on the courts longer and just continue to enjoy many more games of pickleball. Today, I'm super excited to have Jeff Troesch on this call today. I happened to meet Jeff at a local pickleball court, and he actually played with my mom, and we ended up getting introduced. And I'm really, really excited to have him on here to share more about what he does with mental training and with sports performance. So Jeff, welcome to the podcast. Can you please share a little bit more about what you do and how you serve in your community?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Sarah. I am my 36th year of doing mental training for athletes across a broad domain of sports. One of the early dinosaurs in the world of sports psychology, actually back before sports psychology was much of a thing in the United States. And over 3.5 decades, I've been fortunate enough to work with and alongside some of the top athletes in the world in multiple sports. One sport in particular in which I had a lot of traction for a number of years was I was in professional tennis world for years, traveled on both the ATP and WTA tour, and worked alongside some of the best. That segued into me working with multiple Division I college teams and coaches and players. And what flowed out of that, sort of interestingly and inadvertently over the last few years, particularly once COVID hit and people caught the pickleball bug and pickleball mania sort of took off, I found myself in the midst of having particularly professional pickleball athletes reach out to me through my tennis background, and because I play pickleball a little bit myself, I had enough interest in it and desire to help that I started working with several players out on the tours, and that's where I get traction now in the pickleball world. I work with multiple athletes in other sports currently, but the pickleball base that I have are largely some of the top pros out there on the circuit.
That is so exciting. And it's really cool because, when you're an athlete, there's a mindset that's pretty consistent that you need to be open to no matter what sport you're playing. And so it's really cool to see how your training and your work over the years has been able to help people in different pockets of sports, which is really exciting. And the pickleball world is very excited to have you, which is really cool for that. So what is something that you've noticed when working with these athletes that is kind of a common thread of something that an athlete needs to train into, something that maybe more people don't consider when approaching sports psychology?
Yeah, fair question. I think I'll answer that question and also tie it into the fact that I work with the highest level pros. There's also application for the 2.5s and 3.0s and 3.5s, because a lot of times people think, oh, the mental training thing is just for those pros that want to go from good to great, or want to go from 5 in the world to 1 in the world. And certainly working on the mental part can be additive for them. In the end, it can be additive for basically any pickleball player at any level. Some of the common denominators, some of the common threads. One would be people getting a deeper understanding of the value in having a consistent in-between point routine, so that when a point ends and the next point begins, oftentimes people allow their internal environment to be randomized based on how they played the last point, or what sort of quote momentum is happening within the score. Sometimes there's interaction with their partners, sometimes not. Primarily, I do work with singles players, but a lot of the work that I do is with pairs, working in doubles, which is how most of we who are older, we mostly play doubles, as you know. And there are a number of things that can occur even in the very short time in between points that can be very beneficial for pickleball players to have their attention be intentional and to have themselves brought to the baseline, either serving or returning, with an internal space that's relatively consistent. But a lot of people haven't yet chosen to structure that or put that in sort of a purposeful or intentional fashion, so that they're sort of situationally agnostic and not letting the score dictate what's happening inside them. So that's one piece. And as I'm speaking about score through that thread, what I see with the pros and I hear a lot with amateurs like myself is people get very influenced by the score. The language changes, their tension level changes, people's strategy often changes. It's, they're very different sounding and playing at 9-all than they were at 2-1 or something. Mm-hmm. And so part of it is helping people understand the messaging that they're giving themselves based on how they're interpreting the score or the situation that they're in, how that has the potential to influence tactical awareness, how that has a potential to influence tension on the court. People get tight or tentative, or sometimes a little like too aggressive. They just basically go off their typical game style because they're allowing score to influence. I would say those are probably two of the top few things that I'm working on across the domain of beginners through high level pros.
That's exciting, and I can see how that plays a factor in a lot of players, and whether they're competing or whether they're playing recreationally. A lot of people tend to get very influenced by the way that the score is going or the way that the last point was made. And it's definitely a nature to just kind of go through the flow of that. But when you're trying to get into a headspace of competition, of moving on to the next point, and whether it's enjoying the next point or really trying to get that next point, and shaking off any mistakes that you might have made or anything that you might have missed in the last one, I can see how taking that time between points will really help you to just ground again. And I like the terminology that you used in the sense of kind of being agnostic to the situation and just kind of letting it be, because that helps to separate your performance from your next performance, which is really cool. Yeah. Which I love. And that's something that can really help with mental and psychological recovery between points. And because there's a lot of people who will take it really, really personally when they miss a point or they mess up a point, and that detracts from their ability to enjoy and to be engaged with the rest of the game. So that sort of mental recovery is really important. I wanted to have you expand a little bit more on that. How can someone even start to try to separate that, especially for people who are very, very into their performance or in that moment to moment basis? How would you even begin to objectively kind of distance yourself from that last play?
Yeah, well, there are several models from which I work, and one of them, there's the cliches are cliches because they're valuable, generally speaking. And mm-hmm. The notion of playing pickleball, like tennis, like every sport, playing at one point at a time. And so we talk about one point at a time in a general sense, but there oftentimes is not an understanding about how to actionably put yourself in the one point at a time mentality. Excuse me. So part of it for me is an understanding, just very briefly. I don't want to get too deeply into lecture mode here, but very, very, very briefly, it's having a clear intention, like a plan for the next point. If I'm serving or returning, what my intention is for the next point. So clear about my plan, fully committed to that plan as I step to the baseline, so I'm not sort of fuzzy in my head. Mm-hmm. Then execute the point, and then the post point internal dialogue, the post point recovery process and reflection process is, generally speaking, where a lot of people break down or don't really have a method. And largely what I like is for people to have both sort of a simultaneous physical and internal routine. So the physical routine, as an example, could be something like, as soon as the point is over, I'll use one example, as soon as the point is over, I know I'll use my own. As soon as the point is over, I immediately call the score. So I'm ready. So let's say it was 2-0-1 and we won the point over. I'll say, as soon as the ball's on the ground, point over, I'll say 3-0-1 as I'm going to pick up the ball. For me, it triggers an immediate next point mentality, because I'm getting mm-hmm. away from the last one and immediately starting to engage into the next one. I also prefer to have back turned to the net and walk away from the previous point. I also prefer to have the paddle put in the non-dominant hand to separate from one point to another. Some people will go so far as to go back and touch the back fence, or which is, I generally, if I'm serving, I will always touch the back fence as sort of a separator between points. These are things that the pros that I'm working with will do too. They'll go touch a towel, they'll turn their back to the fence, they'll use a focal point of putting their eyes somewhere on their paddle, or put their eyes somewhere in a way that basically draws their attention to something that narrows their attention here, so that they're not thinking too much about the previous one. So from a physical perspective, that's what's going on. Internally, we like something akin to, as soon as the point's over, getting into the mentality of next time, which again triggers the next point. So next time, let's do that again, because that worked really well, or next time when that ball is there, I'm going to slide over a little bit. So we're making either a reinforcement of the previous one, which we want to double down on, or we're making an adequate adjustment. Oftentimes people are looking backwards, or I should have done this, or why didn't I do that? Or, and there's a lot of like looking in the rear view mirror post point for people. And I'm all about like, be in the windshield, look at the next one, like a glance in the rear view mirror, like what did I learn there? But then it's like windshield for the next one, so that our internal dialogue, how we're talking to ourselves, how we're interacting with our playing partner, along with the physical actions that we're undertaking, can create a more consistent internal environment, so that becomes something that is actionable, largely in my control, and sort of resets me in between points on a consistent basis, both physiologically. So heart rate comes down, breathing comes down, attention narrows, intention becomes clear. It's all these little pieces worked on and sort of tweaked with a screwdriver, as people develop these things, so that it becomes something that's continually actionable.
Absolutely. And I like that there's a physical component in addition to the internal component, because it just disrupts the flow just enough, not to necessarily get you out of any sort of helpful zone that you're in, but enough to just kind of give you a little bit of a reset to look ahead to the next play, or look ahead to the next point, which a lot of people, when they get stuck in that, like their heart rate's elevated and they're either excited or devastated about how that last point went, the internal environment is a lot more stress, and there's a lot more possibility for mistakes in the next play, whether in how they try to play and how they show up skills wise, and then also for potentially injuring themselves, and because they're maybe missing a step or overextending themselves, or some other example. But I love that component of giving you a moment to just give yourself a chance to reset and to look ahead. And I like the windshield analogy, and glancing in the rearview mirror just for the moment, but still overall you're just moving ahead to the next one. And that's something that a lot of people forget, how much just changing up your environment just a little bit can really, really help you to recenter and to ground again, which is a really, really cool strategy to use. With that, I know that there's a lot of mental training and sports psychology that we talk about on the courts, but is there anything that you do off the courts that also helps you to support that sort of mindset, or that flexibility to be able to move from one point to the next?
There are a lot of things. Again, we can get deeply into the weeds and the details if you'd like. There are a number of things related to attentional control, related to people having more clarity and awareness of their own self-talk about how their choices to think about things in a particular way are generating anxiety, or a lack of confidence, or some sort of an influence on their internal environment, on the quality of their game. And so those sorts of explorations can be had away from the court. Actually, 95% of the work that I do is not on the pickleball court with the players with whom I work. It's doing Zooms, it's talking with them face to face, and interfacing related to some of the external and internal distractions that can occur that ultimately influence the quality of their preparation, the quality of the internal environment when they step into a match, even before the match has begun. There are a lot of things that can influence a person none of us play pickleball in a vacuum. We all have lives that influence pickleball, and for some of us, we
Yes.
allow our pickleball to influence our lives.
Yes.
Certainly, if we're a pro, that's the case because it's their livelihood and their career.
Mhm.
But even with the casual weekend warriors that are out here doing their thing, oftentimes the way what people bring to the court in terms of a demeanor, in terms of confidence, in terms of intention, all those things can influence the quality of their pickleball performance. And I think another thing that's really important too that I see a lot, and this actually creates, I think it's sort of an interesting dynamic in pickleball in the public domain, in the casual public courts and whatnot, is there's a fair amount of tension. I think if you're around pickleball at all, one would recognize that there's a lot of tension between players in the pickleball community because of the broad spectrum of why they're there.
Yeah.
There are some people who are extraordinarily competitive. They are there because they want high quality rallies. They want to be stretched in their ability. Other people are there, let's say the opposite end of the spectrum. Some people are there completely as a social environment. They enjoy the game, but it really brings them in contact with other people. And then, everybody else is sort of in the middle of that with some mix of both of those things being their primary motivator for being there. And I do see at times too, and from a mental perspective, I think this is important, that when you get four on the court and people have sort of a different agenda for why they're there, that can sometimes create a distraction. The social people sometimes get a little frustrated with overly competitive. The competitive people sometimes get a little frustrated with the overly chatty or the overly social. And so there can sometimes be this tension where people are put on the court together with different sorts of reasons for even being there. And I feel like from a mental perspective, that can be a challenge in the environment as a whole. And certainly when one's out playing the game, it can be a little bit distracting. People are typically looking to find their tribe, but oftentimes we don't have the luxury of being able to size everybody up and stick with our four as things mix, particularly in the public domain. And I see that it's an why I say it's an unusual thing, because in tennis, as an example, you're not going to have four random people with completely disparate ability levels thrown on the court together. You just don't. Or pick up basketball, you're not going to have a beginner show up and have play with, hey, can I play with you guys? But in pickleball, there's this like, yeah, everybody's welcome sort of a thing, and which is an awesome thing about the sport. It also creates a lot of, I think, internal tension and mental challenge for some people once they get out there.
Absolutely. And I recognize that in a lot of courts where they have multiple courts available to them. That's why they'll usually have like a banner or kind of like a certain court that's like designated for the more advanced players that are really trying to compete, versus the beginners that are just trying to be social. But that tension is definitely visible, and it helps when those groups, when they get together, they're able to kind of define like, oh, is this going to be a game that's just for fun, or is this going to be a game that we're really trying to push ourselves a little bit here. And I think that kind of setting that tone has been very valuable for a lot of people. But yeah, I definitely can see how that tension can build in that area. So with that, and kind of going back to when you're talking about off court, kind of looking at your self-talk and your confidence and any anxiety you have towards the game, that's something that a lot of people deal with outside of just considering pickleball and sports and stuff like that. So I can see how there's kind of that dual relationship going either way, of the way that you view yourself off the court and also the way that you view yourself on the court and how you show up in either of those situations. I was wondering if you could chat a little bit more with some actionable ways people could get started with trying to help bring a healthier baseline in both situations.
Well, I think one is for people to understand their why. Why are they playing at all? And it's a little bit woven into what I was just talking about, but it's also it's a separate issue too. Is like if people have a clear intention of what they're hoping to get out of their experience today on the pickleball court, I think a lot of times people sort of careen through life without a real deliberate intention about not that everything has to be about accomplishing something or producing something. I don't mean that. Although for some people that's how they're wired and that's what works well for them, and that's fine. I'm a big believer that there's no right way to do anything. I just feel like there's an effective way for all of us to figure out for ourselves, like what works best for us. And so being intentional about like, why am I going to the pickleball courts today? And looking to serve that master of like, I'm here just to have fun. I'm here just to whatever. And then checking with myself as a player, in the midst of it, like, am I actually doing what I want to do here, or am I allowing myself to stray to a place that's really not very productive for me, not very enjoyable for me, or whatever. So sort of keeping myself on task to the degree that I can with what I really want to do. Additionally, the whole notion of self-talk, the foundation, one of the foundational elements of mental training is for people to understand how their thought process influences their emotional state and how their emotional state influences their action. And I essentially teach life skills through a sport environment, because these are cross-purposed, where away from the court and on the court, a deeper understanding of like, wait a minute, why am I interpreting things that way? A lot of what I do is to help people. So the actionable piece would be for people to become more aware of their thought process in life, in pickleball, wherever it is. And the higher level of awareness then permits a greater flexibility for making choices about how I interpret things, how I evaluate things, how I judge things, to be more aware of my tendencies related to that, and then a reframe off of that, or some flexibility off of, I can think about that differently, or I could choose a different way to look at that. Those sorts of intentional shifts away from our habits of thought can influence our emotional stability in a more healthy and helpful fashion, so that we're not yo-yoing based on circumstance or based on how we're choosing to look at things. Because I'm a big believer that we can choose oftentimes our reactions. There are times when our reactions are sort of reflexive, but once we have our instantaneous reaction to things, we still choose our response from that point forward. So away from the court, it's like actionably taking more of an accounting and holding oneself responsible to having a different response set when adverse conditions hit, or when things are going really well, or whatever might be occurring, because the situation doesn't create our emotion. It's our choice to think about the situation that influences how we feel. And so away from the court, people can go through some exercises of like being purposeful, of paying attention to what they're thinking, purposeful about thought shifting and changing, purposeful about a reframe of how they're looking at things. And those sorts of things can influence how they approach things on a going forward basis.
Yeah, I like what you said about the difference between a reaction and a response, because there are a lot of things that happen to us that, just in an initial, systemic response, there's something that's going to happen. But the way that we choose to channel that energy and how we respond from that energy can vary greatly. That's why two people can have the same situation, the same event happen to them, and have completely different responses in the way that they walk away from it. And I think that intention to pay a little bit more attention makes a big difference, even if you're not being like super proactive necessarily. Just not existing in a passive state when things are happening to you can give you a leg up on just the way that you're able to notice how your mind and your body is responding to each of those things. And there's a lot of people in their everyday life that lives very much in a way where life just happens to them and they don't really pay any attention to it. And then there are people who kind of just pay a little bit more attention and just observe and take a noticing stance on it, rather than just kind of on autopilot for their whole life. And you can live with that life with intention without necessarily having to go out and be gregarious. You can also live an intentional life and be very, very calm and very chill because you've been able to differentiate what does make a difference and what you do want to internalize versus what you want to kind of just let go. And I think
Agreed.
that's a very important reminder that we tend to forget whenever we're picking up a new activity that's really exciting. Is especially when it is new, we have that tendency to be excited about it and to jump in and go hard and get really excited. Like, someone gets introduced to pickleball and they want to play 5 days a week for like 3 hours at a time because
Yeah.
it's so exciting. There's definitely that systemic response, that emotional response that comes into play. But if we can start implementing that awareness and that attention earlier on when we start playing, then that's going to help us in our life skills in addition to our sports psychology, which I love that you touched on that point. I think that's really important that we forget.
Yeah, it helps us build habits that have effect everywhere in our lives. And a little bit of a segue into your world would be the same thing holds true and valuable for athletes when they're injured.
Absolutely.
So post-injury rehab, even again the weekend warrior with the pulled hamstring or the slightly tweaked quad or whatever, we who are old have a tendency to something sore the next day. It's just a matter of what and to what degree,
Yes.
and how we choose to respond to the necessary process of healing or injury rehabilitation. I mean, the mental piece of rehab and the mental piece of coming back from surgery in a sort of more catastrophic circumstance, or even just, yesterday I did whatever, tweaked my ankle a little, got a little pulled groin, whatever. How people choose to respond to that, how much attention they actually give that. Some people, will overdo it overshoot it to the point where they maybe shut it down longer than necessary in a more cautious than potentially is necessary. Most of the people who I hang around, it's the opposite end of the spectrum where, just, take a couple Advil and we're good. And we're probably not making the wisest decisions at times in order to accommodate, one more game sort of a mentality, which is what pickleball often is about. But I think, I think it's another one of those areas of exploration and examination of like how people approach from a mental perspective their rehabilitation or their coming back from injury is another whole sort of interesting thread as well.
Absolutely. I definitely can see the crossover from hearing you talk so far and seeing how it ties in with physical therapy. Because like you said, there's some people who's like, no pain, no gain. Let's just get one more game in and well, the body will work itself out. But like even within a given game, the entire game is just a process and you have to take each point at a time. Similarly, when we're recovering from an injury or when we're trying to build up our skills and performance to, try to stave off an injury, it's all a process. Each exercise could be equivalent to a point, or each therapy session or surgery or whatever could be viewed in an overall process as just a point in time. And a lot of people get too hung up over the moment by moment at times to really appreciate that there's an overall process that's happening there. And I think that the sports psychology that comes from being able to somewhat distance yourself to each point in time would help people recovering from injury as well, to see kind of the end game and play the long game to see how each point matters, but you can also move on and still make progress into the next one or still make a difference in the next point that you make. And I think that's a great way to bring encouragement in the moment to moment.
I agree. And I think another significant piece as it relates to the mental part of rehab is something, as I get plugged in with athletes across all domains, not just in pickleball, post-surgical mental stuff. I mean, honestly, it's one of the most challenging things for me to do in my business is to work with athletes who are injured or coming back from injury, because there's just so much of a psychological component woven into a person's rehab process, or their identity being on pause because they're no longer the pickleball player. Now they're just this person rehabbing. And one of the things I found really interesting and valuable for athletes, it's no like giant epiphany, but I think it's really been helpful with a lot of athletes, is what I notice is that a lot of athletes get border, or some truly get depressed and border on some mood challenges as it relates to, they're not exercising as much as they normally do, and there's all these sort of physiological components to mental health that can sometimes be compromised. But moreover, just from a thought process perspective and how that influences people in the rehab process, one thing that I've seen that's been very valuable and helpful for some is for them to see, let's say the day after surgery or whenever rehab begins, that like that's a day one, and then their job on day two is to be slightly better than day one, and then day three is to be slightly better than day two. And the reason why we talk about that proactively pre-surgical intervention, if we can, is because oftentimes people will be in a rehab process and on the daily, they're comparing themselves to where they were before the surgery. Right. So they're sort of haunted by the ghost of their past of, oh my gosh, I can barely move right now, and I was so whatever a month ago. Right. And even well into the rehab process, let's say somebody's completed a rehab process and they're entering, reintegration into their sport. So they're going back onto the pickleball court, 4 months after a rotator tear or 6 months after an ACL tear or whatever it is. Oftentimes that's a critical juncture from a mental perspective, because obviously skill set, footwork, movement is probably not comparable to where a person was just pre-injury. Of course, we know, and as a physical therapist, that obviously depending on the person, but oftentimes the long term they're going to be fine. But there's that transitional space where athletes get very scared and nervous and upset and confident. There's some confidence breaches at times because there's so much of a tendency to compare where they are to where they were pre-injury or where they thought they would be now versus what they had sort of future projected. And that's why keeping them present in the rehab process, keeping them about beat yesterday's person, beat you yesterday. That's your goal. It's not about what you want to do 6 months from now or where you were 4 months ago. It's about on the daily. And the more we can keep people present in the rehab process, the more we can help them see those little wins, the less likely they will be to go to an emotional space that's non-productive. So that's something that I'm working collaboratively alongside the physical therapist or the physician or the athletic trainer, whoever I'm working alongside, and we do that work collaboratively to sort of keep their mind in that sort of space.
I love it. And I think it's important, to highlight again, like we tend to get into this headspace of rushing it, and we really can't rush those recovery processes. And I like the reminder that, when you get surgery, that's day zero. You're in a brand new phase. You have to appreciate and honor the phase that you're in to kind of allow it to run its course. And you just take it one day at a time. Can I be a little bit better than yesterday? And it's not always a linear graph. It's very up and down with kind of the net upward climb, which a lot of people can forget as well. Right. And the emotional component makes a huge difference to how our body responds. I mean, if you look at a systems hierarchy of how the body prioritizes what to respond to first, emotions is at the top of the list. And that's why we see a lot of people recover faster when they have a positive attitude or positive mentality towards the process, towards the journey, is because they're able to get their whole system on board, because at the base of it all is the emotional state is in a good space to be flexible to all those changes.
Yeah. And I think part of that positive space is when athletes are in the rehab process and they're really fixated on what they can do as opposed to what they can't do, because that's where a lot of people live, is in their heads about, I can hardly move. I can't do this. I can barely whatever. And there's a lot of energy put towards what their deficit is or what is inhibited. And the people that I've seen sort of sail through rehab are the ones who are grateful for, well, at least I can do this, and at least I got this. And I was a little better doing this than I was a week ago. And they're really intentional about putting their energy in what they have and what they can do, as opposed to the void. And that's some people say, oh, that's how some people are wired. I mean, I hear that sort of stuff all the time. Oh, that's just not me. I'm not wired that way. Sort of like it's like fatal genetic defect or something, right? and it's like, no, actually you're choosing that. It's a habit for you. And I appreciate it. Feels like it's, just a part of who you are, but it's still a choice. You can still look at things differently and put energy in a different space. So that's sort of the push pull at times with some of the people with whom I work.
Yes, definitely. And I like that you also mentioned how you're working alongside the physical therapist or the physician or the athletic trainer or whoever's involved in the team, because it really
Yes.
is the team. If the whole team is on the same page, then the person and the nervous system and the body that's able to respond to all of these collaborative efforts, they're going to have a more consistent path towards whatever their goal is, as opposed to very segmented and compartmentalized care. And that's one thing that I noticed about successful athletes or people in the sports world, is when they have a team that's all
Yep.
working together on the same page. And the same goes for when we're rehabbing and recovering. You don't want to just talk to the one provider and then talk to the other provider and have no correspondence. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Cross correspondence, to be able to keep everybody in the same boat. So with that, I want to ask just one more question. Are there any
Sure.
resources that you would like to share or recommend to viewers or to listeners to kind of help continue their growth with sports psychology or looking into sports psychology?
There's, at the risk of disappointing, there's so many different avenues, and a big piece of it is I'm just a big fan of customizing to meet a person's needs or perceived needs. There are a number of books out there, and a lot of podcasts. There are a number of sports psychology podcasts that I feel like have some real value. I think in the pickleball world, I know one of the athletes with whom I work, and he was one in the world. I believe he's 6 or 7 now, but he's doing he's my client, but he's doing a collaborative effort with another sports psychologist and writing a book on the mental game of pickleball. And I'm assuming that's coming out somewhat soon. I think that will be interesting. The co-author with my athlete is the guy who wrote the book, The Inner Game of Tennis, Tim Galway, which is sort of the Bible of sports psychology related to tennis. I think it was written in the 1970s. There's some really good stuff in that book that if somebody's just on a starting spot for reading about the mental part of tennis, that would be a place that I would encourage people to consider. I'm a big fan as well of the apps that are out there that help people with mindfulness training and meditation. Headspace, Calm, Insight, Timer are 3 of the sort of most prominent apps related to that sort of a piece. And people on the daily doing something to be intentional about some sort of mindfulness practice or relaxation practice can also be really valuable.
Yes.
Sorry.
You're good.
Trying to get to the end of this cold.
So
I would say, there's value. I have found that, the hundreds of books that I've read and the podcasts that I've listened to, and, all these things, I feel like there's something that I have pulled from everything. And I feel if somebody goes into any of these things with an open mind and is seeking something that they may be willing to apply or integrate, that it's just about being willing to take time to actually do the work, to read or listen to or watch something that they might pull something from and then work to apply it. So I would just say do the work. There's no shortcut to any of this. It's mental training. I guess one last piece is like mental training is the same thing as physical training, is the same thing as physical therapy, it's the same thing as strength and conditioning. I call myself a strength and conditioning coach because I see myself as strengthening and conditioning the mind. And it's the same thing. I don't do mental training, I do mental education. So I get in front of my athletes, we talk about it, and then they actually do the training by practicing. And on it, like as a physical therapist, we might train them in your 1 hour, but then they're doing their rehab on their own. That's the training process. And the same thing from a mental perspective. Oftentimes people will be exposed to these concepts. Oh, this is cool. I saw this in this podcast with Sarah. And then, they don't think about it or practice it or do it until they're 2 months later, like, oh, I'm stressing out. And like, what was that thing that person said on the podcast? Like, forget it. It's not going to work. Right. So it really is about a daily practice of doing something intentional, again, using any of these resources as just absorbing information or putting some application to it so that eventually it becomes something that's integrated into who you are, and you can apply that in your everyday life. You can apply that in every day at pickleball.
Yes, absolutely. And it goes back to just the intention and the awareness and just bringing it back to
Right.
the forefront of your mind. And usually with any piece of information that we intake, we can identify, oh yeah, I resonate with that. I might use that. Or, oh, I
Right.
definitely don't resonate with that. Or
Yeah,
gave me nothing. I'm definitely not going to be considering that.
exactly.
And it's, yeah, like you said, it takes work. It takes intention to go into each of these things and see what we can pull from it. And it's everybody's very customizable. Nobody ever gets to take the same track in
Right.
the same way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm sure the listeners and viewers are going to want to follow up and see what else you're doing. Where can they find you? What else do you have going on that people can keep up to date with
Yeah,
what you're doing, Jeff?
I try to hide. I don't have a website. I never have had a website. I don't advertise. I don't market. I'm fortunate enough to be frankly busier than I can handle the demand on my time. But if people want to reach out for whatever reasons, and I'm not trying to suggest people don't reach out, but honestly, it's sort of old schoolish. They can just email me and I'll respond. And my email is my first and last name, Jeff Troesch @gmail.com. And people can reach out if they want to interact in whatever way. But I'm not trying to sell anything from me. I'm happy to communicate with people and be helpful if I can be, and love talking pickleball since I'm an addict at this point.
Oh,
And
yes.
I get out there and play as often as I can, and love the game. So I love talking pickleball, and I'm happy to help if I can be helpful to
Yes.
someone.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I will include that email in the description. And if any of you guys have specific questions that you'd like for me to ask and maybe bring Jeff on for another podcast episode, feel free to message me as well, or leave a comment, because there's always more questions. Usually when one question gets answered, 10 more show up. And so thank you so much again, Jeff, for being on this podcast and sharing your wisdom and value, educating so that people can start applying that and training it into their everyday lives. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.